It was a regular Thursday evening when Dr. Simone Harris, a successful black woman, drove home after a long day at work. She worked as a lawyer at a well-known law firm, and it had been a busy week. She had just finished a meeting with a client and was looking forward to getting home, relaxing, and spending time with her family. As she drove through the city, the sun had already started to set, casting a warm golden light on the streets. It was a peaceful drive, but that calm was about to be broken. Suddenly, flashing blue and red lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Simone's heart skipped a beat. She had done nothing wrong, but she knew that being stopped by the police could be stressful, especially as a black woman. She signaled to the officer and pulled over to the side of the road, making sure her hands were clearly visible on the steering wheel. She had been in situations like this before and knew to stay calm. The police officer approached her car. He was tall, with a stern expression, and he didn't immediately greet her. Instead, he leaned in and said, "Do you know why I stopped you?" His voice was sharp, and there was a certain edge to his tone. Simone smiled politely and replied, "No, officer, I'm not sure. Is everything okay?" The officer glanced at her, then back at her car, and his eyes narrowed. "This car is reported as stolen. Step out of the vehicle." Simone was surprised. She knew the car she was driving was registered in her name, and she had all the papers with her. "I'm afraid that's a mistake. This car is mine," she explained, trying to remain calm. The officer ignored her explanation, his eyes fixed on her as if he didn't believe her. "I said step out of the vehicle," he repeated, his voice more forceful this time. Simone's hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, but she didn't let her nerves show. She knew how to handle situations like this. She slowly opened the door and stepped out, keeping her movements steady and calm. She was well aware that staying calm was important in these situations. As soon as she was out of the car, the officer's attitude became even more suspicious. "I'm going to need you to come with me," he said. Simone was confused. She hadn't done anything wrong, and yet here she was being treated like a criminal. Simone tried to explain again, speaking in a calm, firm voice. "I'm an attorney, officer. My name is Dr. Simone Harris, and I have all my paperwork right here. This is a mistake." But the officer didn't seem to care. He continued his questioning, his tone becoming more aggressive with each word. He asked her to open the trunk and check her bags, but Simone knew she had nothing to hide. As he searched through her belongings, Simone began to feel the sting of humiliation. She had been respectful and cooperative, yet she was still being treated like a suspect. Passers-by had started to notice the scene, and some were even taking out their phones to record. Simone felt the weight of their stares, but she kept her head high. She had nothing to be ashamed of. She had hoped that once the officer saw the paperwork, he would let her go without further trouble. But it was clear that he wasn't interested in listening to her side of the story. The situation was spiraling, and Simone could only wonder how far it would go. As Simone stood by the side of the road, the officer's actions became more aggressive. He continued to search through her car, taking out each item and examining it as if she had something to hide. Simone's patience began to wear thin. She had already explained herself calmly, but the officer seemed determined to make this more difficult than it needed to be. "Why are you going through my things?" Simone asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I told you, the car is mine. There is no reason for this." The officer didn't respond. Instead, he turned away from her for a moment, as if to double-check something on his radio. The air around them was thick with tension. Simone's hands trembled slightly, but she took a deep breath to steady herself. This wasn't the first time she had dealt with difficult situations, but this felt different. There was something about the officer's attitude that unsettled her. Simone glanced around, noticing more people had gathered along the street. Some were watching curiously. Others were recording the situation on their phones. The last thing she wanted was to make a scene, but it was becoming clear that this wasn't going to end quietly. After what felt like an eternity, The officer turned back to Simone. "I need to search your vehicle again," he said, his voice cold. Simone felt a knot form in her stomach. She had already shown him everything he needed to see. "Officer," she began again, her tone more firm, "I've already given you everything you need. There's no reason to continue searching." But the officer didn't seem to hear her. He motioned for her to stand aside, and without another word, he reached into the car again. It was becoming clear that this wasn't about finding something illegal. It was about control. The tension in the air thickened. Simone's mind raced. What was going on? Why was the officer being so stubborn? Why wouldn't he just let her go? She glanced at the people who had gathered, wondering if they were as confused as she was. As the officer continued his search, Simone decided she had to stand up for herself. "I'm a lawyer," she said, trying to remain calm but with a bit more authority in her voice. "I know my rights. I'm asking for an explanation." At this, the officer paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if the words stung. But he quickly regained his composure. "I'm doing my job. I'm following protocol." Simone nodded slowly, her mind working quickly. She knew that officers were often quick to escalate situations like this, but she wasn't about to let him treat her like this without a reason. "I've already told you who I am," she said, standing tall despite the frustration building inside her. "I want to speak with your supervisor." Now, the officer seemed to hesitate for a moment, unsure how to respond. His hand rested on his radio, but he didn't immediately call for backup. Instead, he looked at her as though she were an inconvenience. But Simone could tell he was starting to realize that he wasn't in control of the situation anymore. With her head held high, she watched as the officer fumbled with his radio. She didn't know it yet, but his hesitation was about to be the first crack in his confidence. Simone was about to show him that she wouldn't be intimidated. As Simone stood at the side of the road, waiting for the officer to make the next move, more people gathered around, drawn by the flashing lights and the tension in the air. Some were just passing by, while others seemed to linger, curious about what was happening. The officer, however, paid them no attention. He continued to rummage through Simone's car, as if looking for something that wasn't there. Simone tried to stay calm, but she could feel the eyes of the onlookers on her. Some of them were taking out their phones, recording the scene. She knew that things were escalating, but she had no choice but to remain composed. She wasn't just going to let this officer treat her like this. "Is there a problem, officer?" one of the bystanders asked, his voice filled with concern. Simone felt a small sense of relief. It wasn't much, but at least someone was speaking up. The officer ignored the question and continued his search, more focused on his own actions than the growing crowd. Simone's mind was racing. She had never been in a situation like this before, and the humiliation of being treated this way in front of so many people was beginning to wear on her. But she refused to let it break her. She knew she had done nothing wrong, and she wasn't going to let this officer drag her through the mud without a fight. With a deep breath, Simone stood a little taller. She had to keep her composure. "I'm asking again, officer," she said in a calm but firm voice. "Can I speak to your supervisor? I have the right to know why I'm being treated this way." The officer didn't respond at first. He seemed to hesitate, perhaps realizing that the situation was beginning to get out of hand. But then, without saying a word, he reached for his radio and spoke into it. Simone stood still, watching as the officer communicated with his supervisor. In that moment, she realized how important it was to remain calm, even when everything inside her was telling her to react. The crowd had now grown, and there were murmurs of disbelief among the onlookers. Some of them seemed to be questioning the officer's behavior, but no one stepped in to intervene directly. As the officer waited for a response from his supervisor, Simone took a moment to collect her thoughts. She had worked hard to get to where she was in life. She was a respected lawyer, known for her dedication to justice. Yet here she was, being treated like a criminal for no reason other than the color of her skin. It stung, but she refused to let it define her. Finally, the officer looked at Simone and spoke. "I'm just doing my job," he muttered as though trying to justify his actions. "I'm following the rules." Simone was tired of hearing that excuse. "The rules don't say you can treat me this way," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm not a criminal." There was a brief silence, and the officer seemed to grow more uncomfortable. For the first time, he looked around at the crowd, noticing the growing number of people watching the scene unfold. It was clear that things were not going in his favor. Simone stood her ground, determined not to let him control the narrative. She wasn't going to let this be just another story of a black person being unfairly treated by the police. She was going to make sure that, at the very least, people knew the truth. At that moment, the officer received a response from his supervisor over the radio. His face grew pale as he listened. Simone could see the change in his expression. He was no longer confident. For the first time since the interaction began, he seemed unsure of himself. Simone watched closely as the officer listened intently to the response coming through his radio. She could see the shift in his demeanor, his confidence slipping away as the words from his supervisor reached him. It was almost as if he realized, too late, that he had made a serious mistake. For a brief moment, the officer's face seemed to lose its harshness, his earlier suspicion replaced with a subtle, uncomfortable tension. Simone kept her eyes steady on him. She could feel a sense of relief starting to build inside her, but she refused to let her guard down. She knew this wasn't over just yet. The officer finally cleared his throat and turned toward her. "I need to make a call," he muttered, his voice lacking its earlier authority. He stepped a few paces away, speaking into his radio again, but this time with more uncertainty in his tone. Simone watched as he glanced at her once more, clearly aware that the situation had gotten out of hand. As he spoke to his supervisor, Simone took a deep breath. She knew this was the moment when everything could change. She didn't want to be just another story of someone being treated unfairly. She wanted to make sure that her voice was heard. Simone's mind raced, thinking about all the cases she had worked on as a lawyer, all the people she had fought for in the courtroom. She had always believed in justice, but right now, she needed to take action. She decided to reveal a bit more about who she was. "Officer," she said, her voice firm but calm, "I'm Dr. Simone Harris, an attorney. I work in civil rights law. If you're really concerned, you can check my identification and the car's paperwork. This is all a mistake." The officer paused, clearly startled by her words. The name Dr. Simone Harris wasn't just a name to him. It carried weight. Simone was known in her field for fighting against injustice, especially within law enforcement. She was a respected attorney who had won several high-profile cases involving police misconduct. The officer could not have known who she was before now, but hearing her name caused his stomach to tighten. Simone's calm, confident demeanor seemed to shift the balance of power in the conversation. For the first time, the officer looked unsure of himself. His hand trembled slightly as he held the radio to his mouth. He had no idea who he was dealing with. And now, the truth was coming to light. The crowd, which had grown even larger by now, watched in silence. Some whispered to each other, clearly surprised by what they were hearing. Others continued to film the scene, unsure of how things were going to unfold. Simone could feel the weight of the situation. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about making sure this kind of injustice didn't go unnoticed. The officer finally hung up the radio and turned back to Simone, his face pale. I apologize for the confusion," he said, his voice quieter than before. "I didn't realize who you were." Simone's gaze remained steady as she met his eyes. "That's not the point," she said firmly. "I don't care who I am or who you think I am. What matters is how you treated me." The officer stood there, unable to offer a response. The damage had been done, and he knew it. Simone had made her point, and now the eyes of the public were on him. She could sense the shift in the crowd's energy, their murmurs of disbelief slowly turning into whispers of support for her. As the officer began to process the reality of the situation, Simone knew this wasn't over. It was only the beginning. Simone's calm and steady presence seemed to hang in the air like a weight, making the officer's unease grow stronger by the second. He had made a mistake, and now it was clear he didn't know how to fix it. His attempt to regain control faltered as he stood there, awkwardly holding the radio and trying to process everything that had just happened. The silence between them felt thick, almost suffocating. Simon could tell that the officer wasn't used to being confronted like this. He was probably accustomed to people backing down, or perhaps getting frustrated and defensive. But she wasn't like that. She had worked hard to build a career, one rooted in fairness and justice, and she wasn't about to let this man's actions overshadow all of it. She stood there, watching him, waiting. He didn't say anything for a moment, and for a second she thought he might try to brush off what had just been said. But instead, he took a deep breath, clearly realizing that the situation was slipping beyond his control. I didn't know who you were," the officer muttered, his voice less certain than it had been before. The words seemed to come out slowly, as if he wasn't sure what to say next. I didn't mean to cause this much trouble." Simon didn't respond immediately. She let the silence hang, letting his words settle between them. It wasn't enough for him to just apologize. It wasn't enough to acknowledge the mistake. The officer needed to understand why his actions were wrong and how they had made her feel. She was determined to make sure that this moment wouldn't be brushed under the rug. "I don't care that you didn't know who I am," she said, her voice calm but firm. "What matters is that you assumed I was guilty from the start, based on nothing more than how I look. And that, officer, is the problem." The officer blinked, and for the first time, Simon saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He was beginning to grasp the weight of what he had done. It wasn't just about the inconvenience he caused her or the discomfort he had made her feel. It was about something much deeper. It was about a system that had allowed people like him to act without question, without consequences. Simone wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been unfairly treated by those in power. Behind them, the crowd continued to grow, their curiosity turning into concern. Some of the onlookers seemed unsure of what to make of the situation, but others were quietly voicing their support for Simone. She could hear a few murmurs of agreement, but for the most part, the crowd remained quietly observant. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The officer looked around nervously, his gaze flitting between Simone and the growing group of people behind her. He seemed to realize that this moment was far bigger than a simple traffic stop. He was now the center of attention, and the consequences of his actions were just beginning to unfold. Simone knew the officer needed to face those consequences, but that wasn't her priority right now. Her priority was making sure that this didn't happen again, that the next person, the next woman, the next person of color wouldn't have to go through the same experience. She wasn't going to let this be just another story. She was going to make sure that the world saw what had happened and knew that it wasn't right. The officer had apologized, but Simone knew the apology meant little without change. With the crowd still watching and the officer now in a corner, she made it clear that she was done being passive. "I want to speak to your supervisor," she said, her voice unwavering. "Now." The officer's face turned red with embarrassment, but he knew she was right. He quickly radioed for his supervisor, knowing the situation had gone beyond his ability to control it. As Simone stood tall, she knew this was just the beginning. The fight for justice wasn't over yet. As the officer radioed for his supervisor, a nervous tension seemed to fill the air. Simone remained calm, standing tall and unwavering, despite the way the officer's mistake had made her feel. She had been patient, polite, and respectful from the start, but now that patience was paying off. The officer had no choice but to recognize that he had messed up, and he seemed to realize just how serious his error was. The officer, now identified as Officer Gray Walters, stood awkwardly by his patrol car, glancing at Simone and then at the growing crowd. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand, his face flushed with embarrassment. He had assumed that he could easily control this situation, that it would be another routine traffic stop. But this wasn't routine. This was a woman who knew her rights, who wasn't going to let herself be treated unfairly. Simone noticed the change in Greg's demeanor. At first, he had been confident, even arrogant, but now he seemed uncomfortable, unsure of himself. His hand shook slightly as he held the radio to his mouth. He was doing everything he could to avoid eye contact, but Simone could see the fear creeping into his expression. The more he looked around, the more he realized the situation was beyond his control. The crowd was still watching, some of them recording the scene on their phones. A few people had even started whispering to each other, clearly sympathetic to Simone. Greg's nerves were getting the better of him. "Please, just give me a moment," Greg said quietly, as though trying to calm himself. He looked over at Simone, his voice now almost pleading. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I'm just doing my job." Simone's gaze never left him. She had heard this kind of excuse before. She knew exactly what he was trying to do, make her feel guilty for standing up for herself. But she wasn't going to fall for it. "You're not just doing your job," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. "You're treating me like I've done something wrong, when I haven't. You're assuming things based on nothing but how I look." Greg swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Simone and the crowd. He had expected her to be just another person who would cower under the pressure of his authority. But she was standing firm, unafraid, and resolute. That was something he wasn't used to. As he waited for his supervisor, the minutes stretched on. Simone could tell he was growing increasingly uncomfortable. She could see him trying to justify his actions in his own mind, but the reality of the situation was clear to everyone except him. He had made a mistake, and now it was only a matter of time before someone higher up would hold him accountable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Greg's radio crackled with a response. He straightened up immediately, but the tension in his body was still evident. He spoke into the radio, his words coming out quickly, almost in a rush. "Yes, sir. I've got her right here. Yes, sir. I'll handle it." Simone watched as he spoke, sensing that something had shifted. The officer knew that his actions were now under scrutiny, and he was trying to act quickly to cover his tracks. But it was too late. The truth had already started to come out. The crowd had become more vocal now, some of them questioning what was going on, while others were openly supporting Simone. Greg's nervousness only seemed to grow with each passing second. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but one thing was clear: his actions had consequences. And those consequences were just beginning to unfold. Simone knew this was her moment. The situation had changed, and now it was up to her to make sure that this moment didn't slip away without making a difference. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the air was palpable. Simone stood tall, still composed, as Greg nervously awaited his supervisor's response. The crowd around them had grown even larger, their curiosity turning into frustration as the officer's actions became more and more difficult to justify. Some of the bystanders were openly questioning why Greg was still treating Simone this way, while others continued to record, their phones capturing every moment of the unfolding drama. Simone could feel the shift in the energy around her. The crowd, once passive, was now clearly on her side. People were starting to speak up, expressing disbelief at how the officer had treated her. Some even murmured about the unfairness of it all. And it didn't take long for the whispers to grow louder. "I can't believe this is happening," one woman said, shaking her head. "She's doing everything right, and they're still treating her like a criminal." Simone couldn't help but feel a small sense of validation. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been unfairly judged, humiliated, or treated with disrespect by those who were supposed to protect them. The more the crowd spoke out, the more Simone realized how important it was to stand her ground. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for everyone who had been through something similar. The officer seemed to sense the growing unrest around him. His eyes flicked nervously toward the crowd, and he shuffled uneasily from foot to foot, no longer the confident figure he had been just moments before. He had underestimated Simone, and now the consequences of his actions were unfolding in front of him. He wasn't just facing a woman he had wronged. He was facing a public backlash that he couldn't ignore. Simon could see the panic in his eyes as he finally received another message through his radio. It was clear now that his supervisor had been briefed on the situation, and the officer knew that he couldn't hide behind his badge any longer. The realization was setting in. He was no longer in control. The crowd had begun to grow more vocal. "This is not right," someone shouted from the back. "How can they treat her like that?" Simone looked around, feeling the weight of their support. She didn't need to say anything more. The officer's actions had spoken for themselves. His lack of professionalism, his rush to judgment, and his treatment of Simone had all been captured in real time, and now there was no escaping the truth. Within minutes, a squad car arrived, and a second officer stepped out. He walked toward the scene, scanning the crowd before his eyes landed on Simone. He quickly approached her, his face calm and neutral. He had been briefed by the dispatcher, and it was clear that he understood the seriousness of the situation. "Man," the new officer said, addressing Simone, "I'm sorry for the way you've been treated. We'll take care of this." Simone nodded, still holding her composure, but she didn't allow herself to soften just yet. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady. "But this isn't just about me. This is about ensuring that no one else goes through what I just did." The new officer nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He turned toward Greg, who now looked more nervous than ever. The second officer's eyes narrowed, and it was clear that he wasn't about to let this slide. Simone knew this was just the beginning of something bigger. News of the incident had already begun to spread, and soon it would be everywhere. The video of the exchange was already being shared online, and people were starting to speak out. Simone was no longer just a victim of unfair treatment. She was the voice of everyone who had ever been unjustly judged. She had turned her moment of humiliation into something powerful. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Simone was ready for it. She had made her stand, and now it was time to make sure that change would come from it. The days following the incident were a blur for Simone. What had started as a routine drive home had quickly spiraled into a turning point in her life. The video of her interaction with Officer Greg Walters had gone viral, and soon news outlets were reporting the story. Civil rights groups reached out, offering their support, and the public response was overwhelming. Simone had never imagined that this small moment would cause such a ripple, but now it was clear that her experience had touched a nerve with many people. Simone knew she had to act. She wasn't going to let this incident go unaddressed. As a lawyer, she understood the power of the legal system and how important it was to use it to create change. This wasn't just about seeking justice for herself. This was about standing up for everyone who had been unfairly treated by law enforcement, and she wasn't about to let this pass without taking action. She sat down with her legal team, and together, they began to prepare for what would be a long but necessary battle. They would file a formal complaint against Officer Walters, challenging the way he had treated her and the way he had violated her rights. The case wouldn't just be about what had happened to Simone. It would be a statement against racial profiling and discrimination in the police force. Simone knew the process wouldn't be easy. There would be hurdles, pushback, and people who didn't want to see change. But she was determined. As she sat in her office, reviewing documents and preparing her case, she couldn't help but think about the bigger picture. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had faced unfair treatment at the hands of those meant to protect them. This case would set a precedent, and she would make sure that it mattered. Meanwhile, Officer Walters was under investigation. The department had suspended him, and internal reviews began to uncover more of his past actions. His history of questionable behavior was becoming harder to ignore, and it was clear that this incident wasn't an isolated one. As more details emerged, it became apparent that Walters had a pattern of treating people unfairly, especially people of color. The public response continued to grow. People who had seen the video or heard about the incident were speaking out in Simone's favor. Social media exploded with support, and activists from all over the country rallied behind her. They saw her as a symbol of strength and resilience, someone who had stood up when it would have been easier to stay silent. Simone wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. She was leading a movement. Her bravery in the face of adversity had inspired many others to come forward with their own stories. It wasn't just a legal case now. It was a call to action for change within law enforcement, for better training, for accountability, and for fairness. As the investigation into Officer Walters continued, Simone held a press conference to address the public. She spoke with passion and conviction about her experience, making it clear that this was bigger than just one officer. She called on law enforcement to examine their practices, to change the way they treated people of color, and to ensure that everyone was treated with dignity and respect. Simone's words resonated with people everywhere. Her voice had become a powerful tool for change, and she knew that the path ahead would be challenging. But she was ready. She wasn't just an attorney fighting for justice. She was a woman who had turned a moment of injustice into a movement for equality. With her head held high, Simone continued her fight, determined to make sure that no one else would have to go through what she had experienced. As the days passed, the story of Simone's encounter with Officer Walters continued to make waves. The media coverage, the support from the public, and the growing movement behind her created a powerful force for change. The investigation into Officer Walters was ongoing, and his actions were being scrutinized more than ever. What started as a personal battle for justice had grown into something much bigger, an opportunity to challenge the system and push for a future where no one would face the same unfair treatment Simone had. Simone knew that the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. Legal battles were rarely quick or simple, but she also knew that her fight was worth it. She had come to realize that what had happened to her wasn't just about one officer or one encounter. It was part of a much larger problem that affected countless others, and she wasn't going to let it slide. As the investigation unfolded, Simone kept her focus on the bigger picture. She knew that one case, no matter how important, wasn't enough to change everything. But it was a start. It was a way to open the conversation about systemic racism and unfair treatment, not just in law enforcement, but in many aspects of society. People were listening, and that was powerful. In the months that followed, the officer's actions led to significant changes within the department. Officer Walters was eventually dismissed from his position, and his case was used as a foundation for new policies on police conduct and racial sensitivity training. The department had no choice but to confront the uncomfortable truth about the way they had handled situations like Simone's. This wasn't just about punishing one officer. It was about changing a system that allowed such behavior to go unchecked for so long. Simone had been a key part of that change. Her willingness to stand up and fight had made a difference. She became an advocate for reform, speaking at community events, working with organizations dedicated to justice, and using her platform to continue pushing for a more fair and equal society. Her story had touched so many, and she knew that her work was far from over. But despite everything, Simone remained humble. She wasn't in this for personal recognition. She didn't want to be seen as a hero. She wanted to be seen as someone who had done the right thing, someone who had used their voice for good. And even though she was proud of the impact she had made, she never lost sight of the fact that this fight wasn't just hers. It was everyone's. As she sat in her office one evening, reviewing her latest case, Simone thought about how far she had come. What had started as a frustrating and painful experience had transformed her life in ways she never could have imagined. She had faced down injustice and turned it into an opportunity for change. And that, she realized, was what made her strongest, her ability to turn adversity into action, to use her voice to fight for others, and to continue pushing forward no matter the odds. Simone knew there would be more challenges ahead. There always were. But she also knew that she was ready. She had faced one of the hardest battles of her life, and she had come out the other side, stronger and more determined than ever. With a quiet smile, Simone looked out the window at the city below. The fight for justice was ongoing, but she had no doubt that together, they would continue to make progress.